"Take that old ranch and get out of our lives," my daughter-in-law shouted before the lawyer even opened my late husband's will. The room went so quiet I could hear the old ceiling fan humming above us. My son lowered his eyes immediately, pretending to study the polished oak table in front of him. He didn't defend me. He didn't even look ashamed. That hurt more than Evelyn's words. I just folded my hands in my lap and smiled softly. Because 10 minutes later, the lawyer would reveal something that would wipe that smirk right off her face. Before I continue, follow my story until the end, and comment the city you're watching from. Sometimes I still can't believe how many people understand this kind of family pain. The lawyer's office sat on the second floor of an old brick building in Amarillo, Texas. Outside, the February wind pushed dust across the empty streets, the kind of dry West Texas wine my husband Walter used to love. Inside, the air smelled faintly of coffee, leather folders, and rain-soaked coats. Walter had been gone for only 11 days. 11 days since the funeral. 11 days since I stood beside his casket while Evelyn cried loud enough for everyone in church to hear her, but somehow never once held my hand. I wore the same dark blue coat I'd worn to the burial. My hands still smelled faintly of cedarwood from Walter's old closet back at the ranch. The ranch. The place Evelyn just called that old ranch. To her, it was worthless land filled with dust, broken fences, and old cattle barns. To Walter and me, it was 42 years of marriage. Every fence post had a memory attached to it. Every acre held part of our lives. But sitting there that morning, I realized something painful. They weren't grieving Walter. They were waiting for ownership. Evelyn sat beside my son in a cream-colored designer coat that probably cost more than my first pickup truck. Her manicured nails tapped impatiently against the table while she whispered things into Daniel's ear. Every few seconds, she glanced at me the way someone looks at luggage left behind after a trip. Disposable. Unwanted. A burden delaying their future. Then she crossed her arms and sighed. Dramatically. "I just don't understand why we even have to drag this process out," she muttered loudly enough for me to hear. "We already know Helen's keeping the ranch." Keeping. As if I were being handed scraps from a table they already considered theirs. The lawyer finally adjusted his glasses and opened the thick envelope in front of him. And that was the exact moment Evelyn stopped smiling. The lawyer cleared his throat and slowly unfolded the final document from Walter's file. I noticed something shift in his expression immediately. Not surprise. Respect. "Before we continue dividing the remaining assets," he said carefully, "Mr. Walker requested that this particular section be read separately." Evelyn straightened in her chair at once. Her entire face changed the moment she heard the word assets. Daniel finally looked up from the table. "And me?" I suddenly remembered something Walter told me 3 winters ago while we sat beside the fireplace during a snowstorm. "If people ever start fighting over what I leave behind," he'd said quietly, "pay attention to who speaks first." At the time, I laughed and told him he watched too many old Western movies. But sitting in that office, I understood exactly what he meant. Because Evelyn was already leaning forward before the lawyer finished his sentence. "Well, obviously the commercial accounts and investment shares go to Daniel," she interrupted with a thin smile. "Walter always said the ranch wasn't practical anymore." The lawyer paused. Then adjusted his glasses again. "I think it would be best if I finished reading first, Mrs. Walker." That tiny correction hit her harder than expected. Mrs. Walker. Not Evelyn. Not family. Just another person in the room. Outside the office window, dark clouds rolled over Amarillo. I watched dust swirl across the parking lot while memories kept flooding my mind faster than I could stop them. Walter and I bought that ranch when I was 26 years old. Back then, it was barely more than 200 rough acres, an old barn leaning sideways, and a house with cracked pipes and no proper heating upstairs. People thought we were crazy. Especially Walter's brother. "You'll lose everything out there," he warned us. But Walter loved that land from the first moment he saw it. And eventually, so did I. We survived droughts, cattle sickness, broken tractors, and years when we counted every dollar before buying groceries in town. I taught third grade for almost 20 years just to help keep the property running. Meanwhile, Walter worked sunrise to midnight repairing fences and managing cattle leases. That ranch wasn't an investment. It was our entire life stitched into the Texas dirt. But somewhere along the years, Daniel stopped seeing it that way. Especially after he married Evelyn. To them, the ranch became unused land. A future resort. A business opportunity. A shortcut to wealth. I didn't fully realize how much they'd changed until 3 days after Walter's funeral. I came downstairs early one morning and found Evelyn sitting at my kitchen table with real estate brochures spread across my counter. Luxury spa resorts. Golf communities. Corporate retreat concepts. And right in the center of the table, a photograph of my home with handwritten numbers across the top. Estimated development value, $18.4 million. That was the first moment fear settled into my chest. Not fear of losing money. Fear of realizing my family had already started planning a future without me in it. I stood frozen in the kitchen that morning, staring at those resort brochures spread across my table like funeral cards. Evelyn didn't even try to hide them when she noticed me. Instead, she smiled. "Oh good, you're awake," she said casually, sipping coffee from Walter's favorite mug. Daniel and I were just discussing options for the property. The property. Not the ranch. Not home. Not the place where her father-in-law spent 4 decades building a life. Just property. I slowly walked toward the sink, pretending not to notice the large numbers printed across the papers. Projected investor return. Luxury cabin expansion. Private lake renovation. Every page looked like strangers had already erased Walter from the land completely. Daniel came downstairs a few seconds later, adjusting the cuffs of his expensive blue shirt. He worked in commercial real estate now, and lately he carried himself differently. Faster. Colder. Always checking his phone. "Morning, Mom," he muttered. Then he immediately looked at Evelyn instead of me. That small moment hurt more than I expected. Because when children stop looking to their parents first, something inside the family changes forever. I quietly poured myself coffee while they continued discussing my future as if I weren't standing 6 feet away. The north side alone could fit 12 luxury cabins, Evelyn said excitedly. Daniel nodded. And the oil access road already exists. That saves a fortune. Oil access road. The second I heard those words, I looked up. Walter almost never discussed the mineral lease with anyone outside the family. In fact, most people in town didn't even know the ranch still held active oil rights. So how did Evelyn suddenly know about it? I kept my face calm, but my stomach tightened. Then Evelyn casually slid one of the papers toward Daniel. "If your mother signs before summer," she whispered, "we can probably close the entire deal this year." Signs what? I wanted to ask immediately. But years of marriage taught me something important. People reveal far more when they think you already trust them. So I stayed quiet. That afternoon, I drove my old Ford pickup 20 miles into town for groceries. Amarillo looked gray beneath the cold February sky, and the wind pushed tumbleweeds along the empty roads outside downtown. Normally, driving calmed me. Not that day. Because for the first time since Walter died, I felt something heavier than grief. I felt unwanted. When I returned to the ranch, I noticed Daniel's truck parked beside the equipment barn. The barn Walter always kept locked. I walked closer slowly, careful not to let my boots crunch too loudly against the gravel. That's when I heard Evelyn laughing inside. "Once she signs the paperwork," she said, "we won't have to deal with this place, or her, much longer." My hand tightened around the grocery bag so hard the plastic nearly ripped. Then Daniel answered quietly. And what he said next made my blood run cold. "She doesn't know about the trust yet. She doesn't know about the trust yet." I stood outside the barn door completely still after hearing those words. The cold Texas wind pushed against my coat, but suddenly I couldn't feel it anymore. Trust. Walter had mentioned trusts before during tax season conversations with our attorney, but I never paid much attention. Walter handled most of the financial paperwork himself. Not because he didn't trust me, he simply liked taking care of things quietly. And apparently, he kept taking care of things even after I stopped noticing. Inside the barn, Evelyn laughed softly again. Well, once the paperwork is finalized, she won't have much choice anyway. I heard Daniel exhale heavily. I just don't want this turning ugly. That sentence stayed with me the entire night. Not because he sounded worried about me. Because he sounded worried about money. I quietly walked back toward the house before they could see me standing there. My grocery bags felt strangely heavy in my hands, and for the first time in 42 years, the ranch no longer felt fully safe. The sunset spread across the fields in deep shades of orange and gold. Walter used to call this time of day, God's painting hour. Usually, I loved watching the light roll over the pastures. That evening, all I felt was tired. Inside the kitchen, I unpacked groceries slowly while the house creaked around me. The old grandfather clock ticked steadily in the corner beside Walter's reading chair. Empty now. Everything in that house reminded me of him. His reading glasses still rested beside the lamp. His boots were still near the back door. Even his denim jacket still hung beside mine in the mudroom because I couldn't bring myself to move it yet. Grief is strange when you're older. It's quiet. Not dramatic. Just small moments that suddenly hollow out your chest without warning. Later that night, after Daniel and Evelyn went upstairs to the guest room, I sat alone at the kitchen table with a cup of chamomile tea and began thinking back over the last few years. That's when things started connecting in ways they never had before. Walter had become unusually protective of paperwork during the final year before his heart attack. He changed banks. Started locking certain files inside his office cabinet. Took more private phone calls with our attorney, Mr. Jenkins. At the time, I assumed he was simply organizing retirement matters. Now I wasn't so sure. Then I remembered one specific night about 8 months earlier. Walter and I had been sitting on the porch during a thunderstorm, wrapped in old blankets while rain rolled across the fields. He looked unusually serious that evening. If anything ever happens to me, he said quietly, promise me you won't sign anything quickly. No matter who pressures you. I laughed softly back then. Walter, who would pressure me? He didn't answer right away. Instead, he stared out toward the dark pasture for several long seconds. Then he finally said something I'll never forget. Sometimes greed doesn't appear until people think the owner is gone. And suddenly, sitting there alone in our kitchen after hearing Daniel mention that trust, I realized my husband may have seen this coming long before I did. The next morning, I woke up before sunrise. For over 40 years, that had been my habit on the ranch. Walter always believed mornings told you the truth about a person. If someone could wake before dawn and still work hard without complaining, he trusted them. I wrapped myself in my old brown cardigan and stepped onto the porch with a cup of coffee warming my hands. The air smelled like dry grass and coming rain. Out in the eastern pasture, the cattle moved slowly through the morning fog while pale sunlight stretched across the fields. Normally, that view brought me peace. But not anymore. Now every corner of the ranch carried questions. What trust? What paperwork? And why had Walter hidden it from me? I barely slept after overhearing Daniel and Evelyn in the barn. Around 2 in the morning, I finally got out of bed and searched through Walter's old office downstairs. At first, I found nothing unusual. Tax folders. Insurance papers. Feed invoices. But inside the bottom drawer of his desk, tucked beneath an old map of the property, I found a small brass key taped under the wood. Walter had never mentioned it. My hands actually trembled when I held it. I stared at that key for nearly a full minute before suddenly remembering the locked filing cabinet in the equipment room beside the barn. The same cabinet Walter never allowed anyone else to open. Not even Daniel. Especially not Daniel after he started working in commercial development. Back then, Walter simply said, "Some things don't belong in everyone's hands." At the time, I thought he meant land contracts. Now I wasn't sure anymore. Around 7:30, Daniel and Evelyn finally came downstairs. Evelyn walked directly into the kitchen, scrolling through her phone without even saying good morning. "You know," she said casually while opening the refrigerator, "I spoke to a developer in Dallas yesterday. They said luxury ranch resorts are exploding right now." I stayed quiet. She continued. "With the right renovations, this place could attract celebrities. Weekend retreats. Executive packages. Horseback wine tours. This place. Not your home. Not Walter's ranch. Just a business deal waiting to happen." Daniel finally looked at me carefully. "You okay, Mom?" It sounded polite. But distant. Like someone asking out of obligation rather than concern. I nodded slowly. "Just tired." That was partly true. I was tired. Tired of pretending not to notice how quickly grief had turned into greed around me. A few hours later, after they drove into Amarillo for lunch meetings, I took the brass key and walked toward the equipment room beside the barn. The wind pushed dust across my boots as I unlocked the old metal cabinet. Inside sat several thick folders. Oil lease agreements. Trust documents. Property maps. And one sealed envelope with my name written across the front in Walter's handwriting. "Helen, only open if you begin to feel alone." The second I saw those words, my chest tightened so hard I had to sit down on an old wooden stool nearby. Because suddenly I understood something terrifying. Walter didn't just prepare for his death. He prepared for what the family might become after he was gone. I sat alone in the equipment room for several minutes before opening Walter's envelope. Outside, the wind rattled the barn doors softly, and somewhere in the distance I could hear one of the horses stomping against the frozen ground. My hands shook as I unfolded the letter. Walter's handwriting looked slightly uneven near the bottom, probably from the heart medication he started taking during his final year. But his words were clear. "Helen, if you're reading this, it means two things happened. First, I'm gone. Second, somebody has already started treating you differently." I had to stop reading for a moment after that. Because he was right. Painfully right. I pressed the letter against my chest and closed my eyes. After 42 years of marriage, Walter still understood me better than anyone else alive. Even now. I continued reading slowly. "The ranch was never just land. It protects you. Everything important has already been secured through the trust. Do not sign anything until you speak to Mr. Jenkins personally." Below the note sat several legal folders neatly organized with yellow tabs. Walker Family Trust. Mineral Rights Agreement. Ownership Structure. I didn't fully understand most of the legal language yet, but one sentence immediately caught my attention. Primary Controlling Beneficiary, Helen Walker. I stared at those words for a long time. Then another detail underneath nearly took my breath away. Any forced sale of ranch property required my written approval exclusively. Not Daniel's. Not shared ownership. Mine. Suddenly, Evelyn's confidence made sense. They thought I didn't know. And Walter clearly intended to keep it that way until the right moment. Later that afternoon, Daniel and Evelyn returned from Amarillo carrying takeout bags and expensive coffee drinks. Evelyn walked into the kitchen smiling brighter than she had since the funeral. That alone made me suspicious. "We had a really productive meeting today," she announced while setting her purse on the counter. Daniel avoided my eyes again. I noticed he'd been doing that more often lately. Evelyn pulled several papers from a leather folder and slid them across the kitchen table toward me. "These are just preliminary authorization forms," she said sweetly. "Nothing complicated." That fake sweetness immediately reminded me of salespeople trying to rush elderly customers into signing contracts. I adjusted my reading glasses slowly and looked down at the paperwork. Land assessment approvals. Development review permissions. Temporary financial representation access. My stomach tightened instantly. There it was. The first real attempt. I looked up calmly. I'd like my attorney to review these first. The change in Evelyn's face happened fast. Not dramatic. Just a tiny crack in the mask. Well, she said carefully, that could delay things for months. Things. Again. Not family decisions. Not grief. Just business. Daniel finally spoke up. Mom, we're only trying to help you. I nodded slowly. I'm sure you believe that. The room went quiet after that. Evelyn crossed her arms and leaned back in her chair. And for the first time since Walter died, I saw something underneath her polished smile. Worry. Because the old woman they thought was confused and grieving had just stopped cooperating. The atmosphere inside the ranch house changed after that conversation. Not loudly. Quietly. Like a storm building far away across open land. For the next several days, Evelyn stopped pretending to be patient. Her politeness became thinner each morning, disappearing piece by piece whenever I refused to discuss the development plans. And Daniel? He became distant in a way I'd never seen before. He spent hours outside taking phone calls near the barn or driving into Amarillo for meetings. Every time I entered a room unexpectedly, conversations stopped. That told me everything I needed to know. One evening, I walked into the dining room and found architectural drawings spread across the table again. Luxury guest lodges. Private event spaces. Expanded horse trails. At the top of one page, I noticed a logo from a Dallas investment group. Evelyn quickly flipped the paper over the second she saw me. But not before I noticed the estimated numbers printed across the bottom. Projected first-year revenue, $26 million. $26 million. Suddenly, the ranch Walter and I struggled to keep alive through droughts and cattle shortages had become a jackpot to them. Evelyn forced a smile. We're just exploring possibilities. I nodded calmly. Without my permission? Her jaw tightened slightly. Daniel immediately stepped in. Mom, nobody's trying to pressure you. That word again. Pressure. Interesting how people only use that word when they know they're already doing it. I quietly pulled out my chair and sat down at the table. For a moment, nobody spoke. Then Evelyn leaned forward and folded her hands carefully like someone negotiating a business deal. You have to think realistically, she said. This ranch is too much work for someone your age. Someone your age. There it was. Not concern. Dismissal. The same way people speak when they've already decided an older person's life no longer belongs fully to them. I looked directly at her. Walter and I built this ranch when we had nothing, I said softly. I think I can still manage breakfast and a few fences. Daniel rubbed his forehead immediately, already exhausted by conflict. But Evelyn wasn't finished. You could move somewhere comfortable, she continued. A retirement community. Smaller house. Less stress. Less stress. As if abandoning my entire life would somehow feel peaceful. I stayed calm, but inside, something shifted permanently. Because I finally understood the truth. They didn't just want the ranch. They wanted me out of the way. That night after dinner, I stepped outside onto the porch alone. The Texas sky stretched dark and endless above the fields while cold wind rattled the old porch swing Walter built 20 years earlier. I sat there wrapped in a blanket, thinking about everything that had happened since the funeral. Then headlights appeared down the gravel road. A black truck slowly pulled beside the house. A tall older man stepped out wearing a brown coat and carrying a leather briefcase. The second I recognized him, my heart tightened. It was Mr. Jenkins, Walter's attorney. And judging by the serious expression on his face, He hadn't driven all the way to the ranch at night just to offer condolences. Mr. Jenkins removed his hat the moment he stepped onto the porch. The cold wind moved through his gray hair while he looked at me carefully, almost like he was trying to measure how much I already knew. "Helen," he said quietly, "I'm sorry to come this late." I nodded toward the empty chair beside me. "You wouldn't drive 40 miles at night unless it mattered." That earned the smallest smile from him. Inside the house, I could hear dishes clinking in the kitchen. Evelyn was cleaning up dinner while Daniel talked on the phone somewhere upstairs. Mr. Jenkins lowered his voice immediately. "Walter asked me to check on you personally if certain situations developed after the funeral." Certain situations. Even hearing those words sent chills through me. I wrapped the blanket tighter around my shoulders. "I found the trust documents," I admitted softly. Mr. Jenkins looked relieved instead of surprised. "Good," he said. "That means Walter's instincts were correct." For a few seconds, neither of us spoke. The porch light flickered softly above us while coyotes howled somewhere far beyond the north pasture. Finally, he opened the leather briefcase beside his chair and removed several folders. "Helen," he said carefully, "your husband structured the Walker family trust very differently from what Daniel believes." My chest tightened. "How differently?" Mr. Jenkins adjusted his glasses. "The ranch itself is only part of the estate." He opened a property map across the porch table. Colored markings stretched beneath thousands of acres surrounding our land. Oil zones. Mineral sectors. Water rights. Then he pointed toward the western edge of the ranch. About 11 years ago, geological surveys discovered significant mineral reserves beneath this property. I stared at him in silence. Walter never told me the full details. He only mentioned future security once or twice over the years. Mr. Jenkins continued calmly. Walter refused multiple corporate buyout offers. Some were extremely large. "How large?" I whispered. He looked directly at me. "The last private offer exceeded $30 million. For a second, I honestly thought I heard him wrong. 30 million. Under the same dusty ranch Evelyn called worthless. Suddenly every conversation from the past week made horrifying sense. The brochures. The pressure. The rushed paperwork. The fake sympathy. None of this started after Walter died. They'd been planning this long before the funeral. I slowly looked back down at the documents. "Daniel knows?" Mr. Jenkins hesitated. "That depends how much Walter revealed before his passing." That answer alone told me enough. Then he handed me another paper. At the top, bold legal letters read, "Primary Controlling Authority, Helen Walker." I looked up sharply. "What does that mean exactly?" "It means," he said carefully, "no land sale, mineral agreement, development contract, or trust modification can happen without your direct written approval." Mine. Not Daniel's. Mine. For the first time since Walter's funeral, I finally understood why my husband protected those documents so carefully. He wasn't hiding power from me. He was protecting me from people who might try taking it. Then Mr. Jenkins said something that made the entire situation even darker. "There's one more clause you need to know before the will reading tomorrow." I felt my pulse quicken immediately. He leaned closer and lowered his voice. "If anyone pressures, manipulates, or attempts to remove you from the ranch," he paused, "they automatically lose their inheritance rights under the trust." I barely slept the night before the will reading. Not because I was afraid anymore. Because everything finally made sense. Walter saw the greed growing long before I did. And instead of confronting it directly, he built protection around me piece by piece, quietly, carefully, like a man repairing a fence before a storm arrives. The next morning, Amarillo woke beneath dark gray clouds and bitter wind. I dressed slowly in my navy blue coat and pinned on the small silver brooch Walter gave me on our 30th anniversary. For a long moment, I stood alone in our bedroom staring at his side of the closet. Still untouched. still waiting for someone who would never come home again. Grief hit differently that morning. Not sharp. Heavy. Like carrying wet blankets across your shoulders. Downstairs, Evelyn was already dressed perfectly for the meeting. Cream coat. Diamond earrings. Hair carefully styled like she was attending a business presentation instead of a family will reading. Daniel looked exhausted. He barely touched his coffee. The drive into town felt painfully quiet. Evelyn spent most of the trip texting on her phone while Daniel kept both hands tight on the steering wheel. Nobody mentioned the trust. Nobody mentioned the ranch. But tension filled the truck so heavily it almost felt alive. When we arrived at Mr. Jenkins' office, several extended family members were already waiting inside. Walter's younger brother Frank. His wife Donna. 2 cousins from Lubbock. Everyone wore polite funeral expressions while secretly watching each other for clues about the inheritance. That's what death sometimes does to families. It removes masks slowly. I took my seat near the far end of the oak conference table. Across from me, Evelyn crossed her legs confidently and placed a leather folder beside her purse. Prepared. Like she expected paperwork to move quickly today. Mr. Jenkins entered the room carrying the same thick file from before. The conversation stopped immediately. He greeted everyone politely before sitting down at the head of the table. Then he opened the folder. I'll begin with Walter Walker's final instructions regarding the estate. The room became completely silent. Outside the office windows, cold rain tapped softly against the glass. Mr. Jenkins read several standard sections first. Charity donations. Savings allocations. Equipment transfers. Daniel received a portion of Walter's investment accounts. Frank inherited several antique firearms and livestock equipment. Smaller assets were divided carefully among relatives. Evelyn's confidence visibly returned with every page. Then Mr. Jenkins paused. He removed another sealed document from the folder. And suddenly, I noticed his tone change completely. The following section, he said carefully, concerns the ranch property, the mineral trust, and the conditions attached to inheritance rights. Evelyn straightened instantly. Daniel frowned beside her. Then Mr. Jenkins looked directly at me before continuing. That was the exact moment Evelyn made the mistake that changed everything. She laughed softly under her breath and leaned back in her chair. Honestly, she said loudly enough for the room to hear, Helen can keep that old ranch and get out of our lives. The room froze. And for the first time all morning, Mr. Jenkins slowly closed the folder instead of opening it further. The silence inside that office became almost unbearable. Nobody moved. Nobody spoke. Even the rain against the windows seemed quieter somehow. Evelyn slowly looked around the room, still wearing that faint confident smile like she thought she had simply said what everyone else was thinking. Then she noticed Mr. Jenkins' expression. And her smile disappeared immediately. The attorney carefully folded his hands on top of the closed folder. Mrs. Walker, he said calmly, would you like me to repeat the exact condition Mr. Walker attached to this inheritance? Evelyn blinked once. What? Mr. Jenkins opened the document again. His voice stayed completely professional, but every word landed heavily inside that room. Under Article 7 of the Walker Family Trust, any beneficiary who attempts to pressure, remove, manipulate, intimidate, or publicly humiliate Helen Walker regarding residency on the ranch shall immediately forfeit all inheritance rights connected to the trust. Daniel's face lost color instantly. Frank actually leaned back in his chair and whispered, "Good Lord." Evelyn stared at the attorney in disbelief. "That's ridiculous," she snapped quickly. I wasn't threatening her. Mr. Jenkins calmly adjusted his glasses. "You stated, and I quote, keep that old ranch and get out of our lives." In front of legal witnesses during formal estate proceedings. The room fell silent again. I looked down at my folded hands to hide the emotion rising in my chest. Not victory. Sadness. Because Walter knew this moment would happen. Somehow, my husband understood exactly what grief and money would reveal inside people. Daniel finally turned toward Evelyn. "Why would you say that?" he whispered harshly. She looked genuinely panicked now. "I didn't know some stupid clause existed." Clause. Not apology. Not regret for hurting me. Just fear about losing money. Mr. Jenkins continued reading. As a result of the violation, all development rights, mineral profits, commercial negotiations, and secondary inheritance distributions connected to Daniel Walker and Evelyn Walker are hereby suspended pending trust enforcement. Daniel looked physically sick. "What does suspended mean exactly?" he asked quietly. Mr. Jenkins met his eyes directly. "It means your mother now holds sole controlling authority over the ranch, the mineral trust, and all future land revenue. Sole authority. Mine. Not shared. Not temporary. Mine." Across the table, Evelyn suddenly looked at me differently for the first time since Walter died. Not like an old woman. Not like an obstacle. Like someone dangerous. And strangely enough, that hurt more than the insults. Because respect built on money is never real respect at all. Mr. Jenkins slid several folders toward me carefully. "Helen," he said gently, "Walter also left written instructions regarding the future operation of the ranch." My hands trembled slightly as I opened the top document. Inside sat a handwritten letter from Walter. Short. Simple. Just one sentence under his signature. "Everything we built belongs to the person who protected this family, not the ones who tried profiting from it." I pressed my lips together hard after reading that. Across the room, nobody spoke anymore. Not Evelyn. Not Daniel. Not even the relatives. Because the power inside that office had completely changed. And for the first time since Walter's funeral, I was no longer the unwanted old widow sitting quietly at the end of the table. The drive back to the ranch felt completely different after the will reading. Nobody argued. Nobody raised their voice. But the silence inside Daniel's truck was colder than any winter storm I could remember. Evelyn stared out the passenger window almost the entire time, her arms folded tightly across her chest. The confidence she carried into Mr. Jenkins' office that morning was gone now. In its place sat anger. The dangerous kind. Daniel kept both hands locked on the steering wheel while rain streaked across the windshield. Twice, he opened his mouth like he wanted to say something to me. Twice, he changed his mind. When we finally pulled into the ranch driveway, the sky had already darkened into deep shades of blue and gray. The porch light glowed softly against the wet gravel while wind moved through the pasture fences. Home. For the first time since Walter died, the ranch actually felt like mine again. Not because of the money. Because the truth had finally been exposed. Inside the house, Evelyn disappeared upstairs immediately without saying a word. A few minutes later, I heard drawers slamming from the guest room. Daniel stayed behind in the kitchen. He looked exhausted. Older somehow. Like one afternoon had suddenly forced him to see himself clearly. I quietly placed my purse beside the counter and began making tea. After a long silence, he finally spoke. "You knew," he said softly. Not accusing. Just defeated. I looked down at the steaming kettle. "I suspected." Daniel rubbed both hands across his face. "I never wanted things to go this far." That sentence hurt more than I expected. Because somewhere beneath all the greed and pressure, I could still hear traces of the little boy Walter and I raised on this ranch. The same boy who used to ride horses through the north pasture at sunrise. The same boy who once cried for 2 hours after a sick calf died during winter. But adulthood changes some people when money enters the room. Especially fast money. "I didn't raise you to push family aside for profit," I said quietly. Daniel lowered his eyes immediately. "No," he admitted. "You didn't." For a moment, neither of us spoke. Then footsteps echoed sharply from upstairs. Evelyn came down carrying 2 expensive suitcases. Her expression remained cold and tight. "This place is unbelievable," she muttered while heading toward the front door. "Your father manipulated all of this." I stayed calm. "No," I answered softly. "Walter protected what mattered." She stopped walking for half a second after hearing that. Then she grabbed her coat and walked outside into the rain without another word. Daniel stood frozen in the kitchen watching the front door close behind her. And suddenly, the house felt strangely quiet again. Not peaceful yet, but honest. Later that night, after Daniel left for a hotel in Amarillo, I walked slowly through the ranch alone. Past the old barn. Past Walter's workshop. Past the cedar fence we rebuilt together after the tornado. 10 years earlier. The air smelled like wet earth and fresh rain. And for the first time in weeks, I no longer felt like an unwanted burden waiting to be removed from someone else's future. I felt something I thought grief had taken away forever. Steady. Strong. Still standing. Spring arrived slowly across the ranch that year. Little by little, the frozen fields softened back into green. Wildflowers appeared along the fence lines Walter and I built decades earlier, and the horses spent longer hours grazing beneath the Texas sun. For the first time since my husband passed away, the ranch no longer felt heavy with grief. It felt alive again. A lot changed over the following months. Daniel moved back to Dallas alone after Evelyn filed for separation. From what I heard through relatives, the investment group dropped their development plans almost immediately once they realized the trust could never be forced into a sale. Funny how quickly people disappear when easy money disappears too. But I never celebrated any of it. Because losing your family, even when they hurt you, is still a kind of heartbreak. Daniel called me one Sunday afternoon near the end of April. At first, neither of us knew what to say. Then finally, in a quiet voice I hadn't heard since he was young, he said, "I'm sorry, Mom. Not for the trust. Not for the inheritance. For me. That mattered more." Healing between us didn't happen overnight. Trust rarely returns quickly once greed enters a family. But slowly, carefully, we started rebuilding small conversations again. Sometimes that's enough. As for the ranch, I kept it exactly where it belonged. Home. With help from a few longtime workers, I restored Walter's old horse barn and converted part of the property into a small therapeutic riding program for children with disabilities and veterans recovering from trauma. Walter would have loved that. Every Saturday morning, the ranch filled with laughter again instead of arguments about contracts and money. And strangely enough, those sounds healed something inside me too. One evening near sunset, I carried a cup of coffee onto the porch and sat in Walter's old chair overlooking the western pasture. The sky stretched endless shades of gold and amber across the land we fought so hard to protect. I unfolded the final letter Walter wrote me, the one I now carried almost everywhere. The paper had softened from being opened so many times. At the bottom of the page, beneath his signature, one final sentence waited for me. "Helen, if they ever make you feel unwanted, remember this ranch stands because of you too." I smiled through tears for the first time in months. Not broken tears. Grateful ones. Because Walter gave me more than land or money before he left this world. He gave me protection, dignity, and the reminder that growing older does not make a woman powerless. Sometimes it makes her impossible to deceive. The wind moved gently through the fields as the sun disappeared behind the hills. And sitting there alone, but no longer lonely, I finally understood something important. Family built only on greed eventually falls apart. But love, respect, and quiet strength? Those things endure long after the money is gone.